Thanks for having me. And hello to everyone joining us today. Uh, Thanks for being with us. So, I'm going to talk a little bit, probably about like 20 minutes, try to keep it short, about the, inspirations for this novel and the writing process, the research process, rather. Some just kind of basic information about how this novel came to be. Then I'm more than happy to take your questions. So the sort of the first time I really thought about this story, the inception of this story, was about 2004, 2005. Those of you who might have been in Tehran at the time, you probably remember that there was a pretty substantial strike organized by the bus drivers union in west of Tehran. I mean, it was in several spots in the city, but the west was the center of it. And the bus drivers, basically shut down that half of Tehran. They kind of stopped, driving their buses. And if you're familiar with Tehran transportation, especially at the time where the subway was not as like common and widespread as it is now, uh, the main burden of public transport in the city was carried by the buses. And so when the bus drivers stopped working, suddenly that part of the city was absolutely chaotic. People were kind of scrambling around, trying to find a taxi or find a way to get to work. And everybody was mad. And uh, yeah, it really kind of hampered the flow of life in the city. So I used to live not far from the bus terminal where the strike took place. And, watching the aftermath of that, how the city was crippled after that event, it dawned on me, for the first time maybe, uh, that the power that the union, workers' union, can exercise on the state is so massive and so effective. If you have like a powerful organization, if you have people who are enthusiastic about the cause and involved in that process, you can do basically anything. You can really force the state and try to kind of get concessions from them and so on. I was kind of remotely aware of the history of workers' strike in the country. I read a little bit about that, but because I never, actually witnessed it firsthand, I've never experienced it in my own life. I really had no idea what it could do. That was, the moment that I realized this is a subject that I want to know more about. And being like a novelist by trade, uh, uh, I thought that maybe one day I should write about this subject, this story. So then over years, while I was in Iran, I, kind of every time, and I went everywhere by buses. I talked to the drivers, sometimes just after the hours at night, I kind of walked by the terminal where the buses were parked. I kind of hung around and uh, tried to sort of befriend the bus driver and, talk, like do some small talks and learn more about like the nitty gritty of their daily job, what they do, day in, day out. So that was part of the research process that, I started there, maybe 2006, 2007. I was, while doing other things on the side, I was kind of dealing with that subject as well. Then another, so this book has basically two aspects. Maybe I should actually give you like a little kind of two-line plot summary of it so you know what I'm talking about here. This book, then the Free Swallow of Him, is about a bus driver, as I said, in Tehran. He's a guy who's basically a nobody. He's never been involved in politics, and he has lost his parents tragically before the revolution. And after that, he's like a lonely man. And just for 25 years, he's been just basically sitting behind the wheel and driving a bus around Tehran. So that's the protagonist, and through one of his friends, somewhat inadvertently, he gets involved in politics and joins the strike that I just pointed out, and ends up in prison, in Evin prison north of Tehran. It's a notorious prison for political prisoners, for those of you who know about it. So the bulk of the novel is set in that prison, and it's divided into two parts. One of them is there are like a few chapters in solitary confinement. There are a few chapters in the interrogation room. You read about like the interrogation process, interactions between him and his interrogator. His name is Hajj Saeed. The protagonist's name is Yunus. Um, so then another subject that I was thinking about was just prison novel as a genre. It has like a long, pretty rich history in the history of literature, especially in Latin America and the Middle East. I mean, for obvious reasons. There are lots of prison novels around. From just off the top of my head, The Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig, or Sonallah Ibrahim's novel That Smell, which is set in prison in Egypt. There are lots of them around in Iran as well. So I read through that body of text, the prison novels. I read quite a lot of them, and one thing stood out to me, which was even though there are like so many prison novels out there, very few of them are actually focused on the solitary confinement as as like the main part of like the story, or the main prison experience of the protagonist. And I was surprised first by realizing that, because not just in Iran, but in a lot of the countries around the world, solitary confinement is a really big part of the prison experience, especially for political prisoners. So I was wondering why that is not addressed adequately in that body of text. Then later on, I think I know why, and maybe mainly for craft reasons, like the craft of the novel, because in solitary, all you have is a person sitting basically in a cage, right, in a very small room. That person can't do anything. There's no one to talk to, can't even move that much. So that's basically a nightmare for a novelist, right? To have a character trapped in a very small space, can't do anything at all. So you need to find a way to basically, through writing about the psychology of that character, or like very little interactions that are possible in that setting between the character and his or her environment. Through that, you've got to find a way to move the narrative forward, and it's hard, and it's very possible that you have to, it gets sort of stagnated now and then. You get into like really big obstacles, in the process of telling your story, and makes it basically impossible, the solitary confinement situation, to to make it a part of a novel. But precisely because it seemed impossible, I kind of decided to take it on, partially because I have a lot of friends in Iran who've been through that experience, and solitary really kind of changed them for good. It really does something to the mind, especially when you're there more than for more than 2 weeks, 20 days. Even that doesn't seem that long, but that's enough to really kind of rewire your brain, mess with your kind of thinking process and your perception of the world when you get out of there. So I decided to take that on as like the main sort of narrative pivot of this book. So a lot of it is set in solitary, and there's Yunus, by himself in that little room. So I had to, find a way to make it move, basically, right? Make it a part of the plot. And what I did for that was just starting to talk to the people who have been in solitary. And I mean, unfortunately, uh, for like real life, but fortunately for this book, uh, I have a lot of friends who have actually been there. I mean, if you're even, like a little bit involved in politics in Iran, especially, not especially, basically since the 979 revolution, chances are that either yourself or someone close to you has spent some time in a solitary cell in Evin prison or elsewhere. And so, yeah, I have, when I was thinking about my friends, I realized that I have about like a dozen, I know about a dozen people who have that. So I started contacting them and trying to, have them tell their stories. What I was really struck by was how reluctant they were, about talking about solitary. So everybody's experience within like the first couple of months in that prison has two parts, as does the experience of Yunus, the protagonist of this book. So for most of the day, you're in the solitary cell by yourself. Then usually a few hours a day, sometimes it can go up to like 8, 10 straight hours of interrogation. And that's basically all your life there. You only see your interrogator as a human being, as another human being, or the guards in the prison. And otherwise you're on your own in a very, very small room. And so when I was asking the people that I was interviewing for this project, I was asking them to talk about their experiences, tell me their stories. I noticed a really stark difference between these two aspects of their time in solitary. They were pretty, quite willing to talk about the interrogation process, right? They had lots of stories about, their kind of back and forth with the interrogator, how things, went in the interrogation room. They had a lot of funny stories actually about the interrogation process. Lots of them, uh, remembered funny details about the interrogator. They can, I don't know, mimic their accents and that kind of things. Uh, but when it came to solitary, right, when I wanted them to talk about their time in solitary confinement, a lot of them didn't even talk. They just refused to say a word about it. And if I pushed them, they got really angry. Um, yeah, so that kind of goes a long way to show how sort of deep and hurtful the trauma of that experience really is for people who go through it. But eventually, I was lucky enough to have maybe 5, 6 people talk to me about their time in solitary, and I kind of gathered their stories, put them together with the other stories that I collected from my readings, from books and other accounts by non-Iranians as well, including a lot of actually I read a lot of accounts by American inmates, right? Because here it's very common as well. In fact, I mean, lots of people don't know that, but solitary confinement in like the modern sense of the word is an American invention, right? It first time as a punitive measure, it was carried out in Philadelphia in the 18th century. Yeah, so these two these were two sides of the story. So the bus drivers union and the strike, and what I saw in Tehran, that basically planted the first seed of this book. Then moving on into the prison chapters, the experience of solitary, I kind of worked a lot and talked to those friends to whom I'm incredibly indebted. I mean, without them, this book wouldn't have existed. So that gathering of those accounts and sort of amalgamation of those kind of first-person accounts with like a lot of kind of reading research, that becomes the material for the solitary chapters. Then there was the interrogator, another main character in the novel is the interrogator. His name is Hajj Saeed. And I also thought a lot about that character too. And I read a lot of accounts by, former prisoners, people who were in jail in Iran, and came out and wrote memoirs about it. And what I noticed in those memoirs and novels was that they're very focused on the individual, like the character of the interrogator as a person. And that, eventually in a lot of those accounts, you've got, like a good and evil dichotomy, pretty, clear cut good and evil dichotomy, or where the protagonist of the book is on the side of the good and the interrogator is on the other side. So I wanted to transcend that dichotomy, and through those characters sort of lay bare a system within which they're operating. So, I try to make clear in the book that this interrogator, because he seems very sort of spontaneous all the time, and he suddenly kind of turns around and something kind of changes the direction of the interrogation process, makes a lot of unexpected moves through the book, as they do in real life. So that when you read that, or when you experience that, they might come off as a little kind of crazy or erratic. But the fact is, they are really following a very strict protocol for interrogation. There are rules they have to follow. There are methods that they, learn and study and practice, and then, apply them on prisoners. And they need to report to their seniors, right, to their senior officers. So I thought that the evil character, the villain, if you like, of this book is not the interrogator, like as an individual. It's the system, or that protocol rather, right? And this is, if you take that interrogator out and put another interrogator, then the new person would do the exact same thing. So this became eventually, maybe not, I didn't intend it to be like that in the beginning, but eventually this became a novel about bureaucracy and the kind of the ruthlessness of a bureaucratic process, in which both the interrogator and the interrogated, one willingly, one of them unwillingly, sort of function as cogs, as two different cogs that are in sort of in tension. So yeah, that's basically, there are like a little bit of like a scattered comments about how this book came about and the research process behind it. I think I can just stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you and take your questions. Thanks for listening to me. I hope you're not bored so far.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have questions coming in, so I'm going to pass them on. One viewer says, this case presents a solitary confinement traumatic event, which is related to a collective trauma experience as well. The magnitude of the traumatic effect on human psyche is massive and overwhelming. What have you discovered in terms of human resiliency of these individuals?
Yeah, it's I don't know. A lot of them just don't become the same person anymore. I know it's like customary to talk about resiliency and how people sort of get through that, process and come out victorious on the other side. Not victorious, but fairly unscathed on the other side. But I didn't see that to be the case, honestly, in most of the cases that I encountered. Especially when you talk to people and have them go deep into that experience, you see how traumatized and wounded they are. Even again, some of them were there for like a couple of weeks, not even that long. I more than resiliency, or more than kind of focusing on human strength as they go through this ordeal, I prefer to us to discuss how we can abolish solitary confinement as a kind of practice, as a punitive practice, as part of the legal system. And it's common across the world. It's not just Iran and the US, because it is definitely a form of torture, psychological torture, lots of times physical torture as well. And most people, if not all of them, who experience that never really become whole, or never become the same person that they were before that. So yeah, there's obviously resiliency. I mean, there are incredible people, really, really impressive people with, really strong will and, like determination that I can never even, imagine like having myself. But eventually, at the end of the day, when we're, as we're talking about a form of torture, I think abolishing it and, just basically jettisoning it out of the law should be our main focus.
Thank you. You have written fiction in both Persian and English. What are some of the differences in the writing experience? Is one more useful for fiction?
They're just different. They're so different. I didn't actually expect uh, to see so much difference or experience so much difference myself. But what I have, come to believe is that uh, in a different language, you're basically a different person. Uh, it's not like you're writing the same thing or you're translating in your mind. When you get down to write something like fiction or poetry, these works of literature that are deeply involved with language, where like the music of sentences matters a lot. When like the word choices are crucial, much more than what you see in an academic paper. When you kind of get to that level, get down to that level of writing in a different language, then you are a different person. And for me now, I feel like I have like two different universes in my head, and they have a very little kind of overlap. So if I sit down and write in English, there's like this other person writing in English, then in Farsi, there's another person. So yeah, I'm basically like in a very kind of schizophrenic state, kind of trapped between two languages. But I don't want to talk about, which one is better, or I think that question doesn't quite make sense. They have different abilities, different, capabilities, and you can do different things with them. I mean, English is obviously like the lingua franca of the world, and Farsi at the moment is kind of very limited and suppressed really in that corner of the world. So in terms of like the literary market or literary reception around the world, obviously English has a completely different status. But when it comes down to page and the words on the page, yeah, what I see is different. I don't know how to compare them. They're different, yeah.
Thank you. One viewer writes, what does the fish swallowed him in your title refer to?
It's a line from the Quran, and this is the story of Yunus the prophet, or Jonah. So the book is, as I said, it starts in a strike in the bus terminal. Then the guy Yunus, the protagonist, ends up in solitary confinement. Then at the end of the book is kind of he gets out of it, right? So the arc of the narrative, somewhat very loosely, is based on the story of Jonah the prophet. And in this book, the belly of the beast, or the belly of the fish, or the whale in the Quran, I took it as a metaphor for solitary confinement, right? It's a very kind of dark, small, sort of suffocating, claustrophobic environment where this character is stuck. So yeah, that's what the title refers to.
Thank you. The book came out in 2020, almost 10 years after you left Iran. How do you think being distant from Iran affected your book? Did it make the writing process more complicated?
Not because I went back to Iran until 2015, right? I lived outside Iran, but I traveled back. I spent a couple of months a year there up to 2015, and I started writing this book in 2016, right? And then it took a while to come out. It's a very long, sort of drawn out process, publication in the US. So because I started writing that immediately after I decided not to go back, it didn't affect me that much distance. There was not much of a distance anyway, right? But I'm feeling that for the next book, which is I'm writing now and I'm about to finish. Um, Now that I've been outside the country for almost 5 years, then I when I sit down to write about like a scene that is set in Tehran and then this or that neighborhood in Tehran, I feel like this longing, this yearning to kind of just go back, even though for 10 minutes, and like smell, the smell the street, or just take a look around and see the houses, or just stare at the asphalt for like 2 minutes. And these are like this, kind of impressions that you get from a setting, and then you can kind of process them into fiction. So I'm missing that right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Has anything changed in the prison system in Iran since you started writing the book, for better or for worse?
It always gets worse. I don't know, like details of that. How if the law has changed. I probably not. I don't think that there's been any substantial change, and if there is, it's usually for the worse. No, I actually haven't followed it, like that. Like the legal system news. I'm really not kind of authority on that at all. I don't know.
And going back to an earlier comment you made, does being away from Iran for so long, do you still see the ability for yourself to write in Persian again, or would your next project be in English?
It will be in English, and right now it's getting hard actually. Um, I think if I go back there and read like Persian for a couple of months and kind of practice a little more, I will be kind of back on track. But right now, if you ask me to sit down and write something in a story, I mean I'm talking about fiction now because I think that's like a different kind of level of engaging with language. If you ask me to sit down and write a story tomorrow in Persian, I'll probably like falter and have trouble. But maybe if you give me a couple of months, I'll be fine.
Thank you. And someone asks if there is a Farsi translation available of this book.
It's in the making, so we'll see when. It's kind of a slow translator is working on it, so we'll see when he's done. Yeah.
And has writing about these kinds of traumatized cases affected you or traumatized you? And how do you cope with that?
Not, I guess not. I mean, I don't, want to kind of give myself too much credit in the process. I just from a distance, I've been just talking to those people. If anything, and the thing that hurt me the most was that those interviews basically jeopardized my friendship with a couple of those people. Especially in the moments that I pushed a little bit, too hard for details about like solitary confinement. Some of them got angry and got upset. So it took a little bit of, like amending afterwards. But no, I think it's just totally different to be there, just talking about it or hearing about it. It's not going to do much to you.
You talk about the protocol in place for the interrogations as an entity beyond us. Do you think this is your voice for criticizing religions?
Yeah, I mean, the Islamic law is, definitely part of that protocol. I mean, a lot of those procedures are inspired by those, religious principles. But, it's very modern at the same time, right? It's very Kafkaesque, and the order of it, and like the strict, kind of dry, bureaucratic language of it. Yeah, it's more reminiscent of, I don't know, what you read in like the communist, Stalinist regimes, the second half of 20th century, or maybe the dictatorships in Latin America. Is that the why being inspired by, like the Islamic law? It's a very kind of modern, maybe specifically 20th century form of, ruthless and bureaucracy.
Thank you. There is some parallel between your novel and Roberto Rossellini's film called General della Rovere, an ordinary man performing an unusual, extraordinary role. Is that part of the theme, ordinary humans as tormented heroes?
I haven't seen that movie, but the character in this book doesn't do anything heroic at all. He's a nobody. He's just kind of being played around. He very accidentally is involved. Is involved in that process, and when he goes to Evin, he becomes like a perfect scapegoat for what was going on at the time in the country. And he's pretty passive, actually. If anything, he's the opposite of heroic. He doesn't really do anything to save himself. He kind of resists a little bit, but he breaks down within a month after imprisonment and just confesses to everything they want him to confess. Yeah, no, he's the opposite of a hero, definitely. Is just some guy who was at the wrong time, wrong place, and he goes down like this, crazy spiral of Iranian politics, and his life is destroyed basically over nothing.
There are accounts of solitary confinement in Persian poetry as well. How is American solitary confinement different, if at all?
Well, for one thing, in Iran, there's a limit to the time you spend in solitary, right? I don't know what the latest is, but it was about 21 days, right? So 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, you had to be taken out. It's usually not, unless there's a very sort of exceptional case. They don't keep you there for too long. In the U.S., there are people in solitary for like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years even, right? So they spend their whole, they're, sentenced to life. And then the rest of their lives, basically, the rest of the prison time, they just sit there in solitary confinement, right? In the solitary cell. And yeah, it's pretty insane. I mean, it's obviously inspired by, this kind of, I think, pretty crazy Protestant idea that if you leave someone alone, with their gods in a room, then, overall I don't know, like the catharsis happens and they, get the courage to face their sins and purify their soul. And they will come out as, like I don't know, man of God or something, right? And that was the original idea back then in the 18th century. It's not talked about here, in so many words, but I think it is still like the underlying idea of solitary confinement in the US as well. So that's why this very sort of strictly religious dimension is involved. And because of that, people just stay there basically forever. And when you read their accounts, you see the level of despair and almost aggression, that it kind of leaps out of the page. It really grabs you by the throat when you read those accounts. There's nothing like that in the Iranian, actually, accounts of solitary confinement because of the time period they spend there. So yeah, I think the U.S. accounts that I've read were more sort of brutal and unnerving and demoralizing than the Iranian ones.
Thank you. Have you experienced or tried to live in solitary yourself as you were writing these parts of the book?
Yeah, that's a kind of interesting story because so when I started working on that, I thought that I can capture solitary experience without being there. No, I haven't been there, by the way. That's the answer to answer the first question. I've had the honor of being interrogated, but never, went to the jail. When I was writing that, yeah, I thought that through research and imagination, I'd, probably be able to capture the solitary experience, but I was very naive. As soon realized, because there are like certain human experiences that kind of defy language, really, defy really words, that defy imagination. I always thought of death as one of them, or maybe you can argue that like orgasm is one of them. There are moments that kind of stand outside language. And I never thought of solitary as one of them, but as I started writing this book and working on this book, I realized that that's actually, one of those experiences where a language kind of falls short, right? You don't have enough words to really address that properly and adequately in fiction. So then I decided to try it myself, and kind of ridiculously in an apartment in Brooklyn. When my roommate was out of town, I I thought I would just stay in my room because our rooms were upstairs. So the rest of and upstairs were just two rooms and one bathroom, and we had a kitchen and sitting room downstairs. So I brought some food upstairs in my room, and I thought, I'll stay there for a few days, keep myself, like fed, and only use the bathroom, similar to what a inmate in solitary confinement might experience. But after a few hours, I realized how ridiculous that is, because it's not about being alone in a room at all, solitary, right? It's about a state putting you in a room on your own, right? So you're actually not alone at all. That's like the complicated aspect of this experience. If anything, solitary confinement is about denying you your solitude. It's you're put in a place where the state is right there into your face in a small room with you all the time. Is the closest to your body imaginable, really. It's basically everything, like it's on your skin, it's just down your throat. It's everywhere with you in that cell. And that's not a situation you can replicate outside prison. You can't just shut the door on yourself and pretend that you're experiencing the same thing that someone in Evin is experiencing. So I tried to do that. I tried to, basically simulate the solitary situation in my room here, but it's the only thing that I learned about that experience, that it's just the impossibility of it. So then I had to rely on, first-person accounts of people who've been there.
Thank you. I want to read a comment from one viewer. They write, I wonder if you might have had more opening with former prisoners on the subject of solitary confinement if they were in a group discussing it amongst each other. One reluctance may be that the person being interviewed doesn't think the listener could understand their experience, not having anything to compare it with.
Mhm.
A group discussion, however, would be difficult during the pandemic. I expect the isolation that is a part of the Zoom experience would be unhelpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I wrote this before the pandemic. It came out at the beginning of the pandemic, so it was the research was done several years before we got into this. But yeah, I think it's a very good comment. It's very accurate. Definitely, I was this kind of naive, ignorant person, just hungry for stories, like pushing people, wanting them to tell me as much as they can, not realizing like the limits and like the mental blocks that they have in this process. It actually is similar to, because I grew up in was in south of Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, right? And my mom was a nurse in like a war zone hospital, so I experienced the Iraq war firsthand. And I have, I have a lot of memories and stories from my childhood. So when I get pushed to talk about them, later it happened in Tehran a lot, right? People want to kind of hear about like the experience of a child in the war zone. It pissed me off so much because I had such a hard time articulating those experiences and talking about what I witnessed as a child. I can see a similar thing happening when someone like me who knows nothing about solitary pushing someone who has been there for stories, right? I can see how annoying and irritating it can be. But I mean, I was lucky that people I talked to, most of them were very generous, despite my obnoxiousness, they were willing to share.
Why do you think fiction by Iranian writers hasn't reached the same level of international acclaim as Iranian cinema or painting?
Yeah. Well, I think the a big hurdle on their way is censorship in Iran, and it's much stricter than what goes on in like painting or cinema. Maybe cinema is a different story because they found the style, a certain kind of imagery, and that has like a character of its own. And so they kind of found a way. People like Kiarostami, um, Panahi, and others found a way to kind of get around that, censorship obstacle. But in literature, we haven't been able to do that. So, the novel, the thing about the novel is that it has a kind of a unique capacity to address limit experiences, the moments that human beings reach their limits in different ways and in different fashions. So, if you want to read a story of someone like a religious person who is suddenly kind of crippled by doubt, for instance, right, about the existence of God, I think the novel is probably the best literary form that can convey that. Or I don't know, like maybe the story of a political uprising. I think the novel is a perfect vehicle for communicating that, how someone kind of finds themselves basically in the eye of the storm, the eye of the political storm, and you know uh, starts sort of fighting, sacrificing for a cause bigger than themselves. I don't know, like experience of love, the intensity of love. Fiction can do a really good job bringing that home. And all the things that I said, if you just go a little too far in any direction, writing about those experiences, you will run up against the wall of the censorship, right? So I think it's censorship has completely suffocated Iranian literature over the last like 30, 40 years. 30 years especially, ironically in the 80s, the censorship didn't have the stranglehold that it has now. But over the last 30 years, gradually it has kind of chipped away at the ability of writers uh, to tell stories. They'll tell their stories in the way they wanted to tell them. And as a result, to be fair and honest, like the Iranian literature today, especially in terms of the novel and short stories, especially the novel, which is like the main literary genre of our time, doesn't have much to offer to the world, right? All those like truncated stories don't really do justice to their subject matters and to the characters in them. And you can't really cheat your way into like the global market, right? When you can't write about when you can't write honestly about your subject, then nobody's gonna buy it. So yeah, there are other factors as well, but I think that the conversation about the Iranian literature today just has to start from censorship. There's no way around it. I get actually a little annoyed when I see people have different sort of points of departure discussing that issue. Like the metaphor that I have is that you've got a singer, and the singer is kind of lying on the floor, and the very fat person is sitting on his face, right? And so then there are people analyzing why that singer is not singing or is not singing well without mentioning that fat person, right? Yeah, you got to basically make that fat person get up first, and then we can the guy on the floor can actually start singing. Then we can start listening to them and see how they sing. We haven't really had that opportunity over the last 30 years. So yeah, no wonder no one knows about our literature.
Thank you. I want to read a comment and then a question from two different viewers. One viewer writes, would like to point out that there have been memoirs about prisoners being held in solitary for more than 21 days in Iran. And another viewer writes, when interviewing others about solitary confinement and imprisonment, what aspects do you think were hard for them to articulate to you? And how did you fill the gap, so to speak?
Hmm. Just like the sheer loneliness of this because in solitary, the way I kind of understood it after talking to those folks, uh, you kind of become your own enemy after a while, right? Because you start obsessively kind of digging through the past And like, I mean, forgetfulness is a survival mechanism, right? We are able to forget in order to survive. It's an evolutionary process. Um, so yeah, and we are very good at forgetting like the tragedies of our life. That's how we basically survive, and kind of never avoid sort of mental breakdowns as we go along the way. So everything you manage to forget in your daily life just comes rushing back, to haunt you when you're in solitary. And you apparently, from what I hear, obsessively think back on the moments of your life where you hurt someone, or you messed something up, or you made a big mistake, and you kind of start punishing yourself, and giving yourself a lot of guilt. And yeah, that's one thing. For instance, you create a self of yourself that you despise when you're there, right? And you kind of obsessively struggle with that self and think about that self. So that's one reason it's hard to talk about it, with someone else, right? When you get out and you're asked, hey, what happened there? What were you thinking about? It's not easy to say, yeah, I created a self that I hated, and I just kept hating it through my time there. Yeah, that's one reason. There are lots of reasons. I mean, there are a lot, experiences that are, I mean, when you come out, are just embarrassing, right? Like the personal, I don't know, like day to day activities of, from like eating and going to the bathroom, or all of these things are going to be uh, yeah, out of, none of that are going to be ordinary when you're there. So you do things that would be considered embarrassing on this side of the wall. Yeah, those are not easy to discuss either. Yeah, but there's a lot. uh,
Thank you. I want to read one more question, and then we'll have a few minutes after that if there are any readings from the book you'd like to do. And if not, we can end with a few more questions. So let me ask you this one more question.
Yeah.
Do you think physical mobility is a major difference between freedom and captivity? If so, do you think women whose freedom of movement has been traditionally controlled and combined have an easier time experiencing prison?
I don't know about women having easier time experiencing prison. I can't make assumptions, and then the people I interviewed, none of them were women, so I don't really know the answer to that question. But yeah, I mean, the ability to move, I bet you can argue, is basically the definition of freedom, right? That if yeah, if you're absolutely free, if you can go from any moment in space to any other moment in space at will. I think that's a pretty good definition of freedom. That's why, like, just by virtue of being in Iran, like living in Iran and outside the prison, I mean, outside solitary or cell, there is like a certain level of the curbing of your freedom. For one thing, you can't just travel there, right? If you want to go anywhere, you need to get a visa, and lots of times you get rejected. So that's one kind of constraint on your freedom. So yeah, I do believe that it's a pretty good definition of freedom, right? The ability if you decide to go to another moment, another point in space, it might be like in Australia or around the corner, in Delhi around the corner. It can be anywhere. Uh, the more options that you have, the more uh, the more ability that you have to kind of go to different spaces, different points in space, the freer you are. Yeah. So then it follows that solitary confinement, given like the size of the cell, probably the harshest restriction on one's freedom.
Thank you. Would you like to do a reading from the book or continue with questions?
I mean, I can take questions. I think book. I mean, people can read it. Yeah, my.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. One viewer is asking what advice you would have for aspiring writers.
No, I don't really have one. Read. I think that's probably the best advice I can give. The good thing about writing is pretty bad overall. Like it's a totally underappreciated job. There's no financial gain in it, so it's not like a really rational decision uh, for life. I think you should be a writer if you really, you know, it's a virus. I mean, if you have that virus, then you should do it. But other than that, the good thing about it is, becoming a writer is practically free. I think, all you need is pen and paper and a, library card. And yeah, the best thing a writer can do for themselves, or like a young writer can do for themselves, is reading. Reading voraciously, avidly, obsessively, across genres, across cultures, preferably in more than one language. I think being multilingual, bilingual at least, is really helpful, for a writer, because you have like different, you understand nuances of one more than language, then it really helps you when you come to your writing language. You can translate a lot from another language, in terms of like the music of the sentences and the rhythm of writing and all of that. Yeah, I think the reading is probably would be my only advice. That's and there's no shortcut to that either. Like I know there are like all kinds of workshops and creative writing classes. I'm teaching one, those courses at university as well. But at the end of the year, at the end of the day, if you're not an avid reader, you're probably not going to be a successful writer. I think that's the bottom line.
Speaking of reading, which author inspires you the most when writing in English and in Persian?
I don't know. There's so many. I mean, I love Joseph Conrad, for instance. Among the people who write in English, well, there are like certain traditions that I really like. I like the early 20th century modernism a lot, like Joseph Conrad, Virginia Woolf. Ford Madox Ford was not that known these days. Then I really love the tradition of the post Second World War Jewish American literature, like Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Bernard Malamud. Those writers I really admire, especially just the writing, like the quality of their prose, I think is really stunning and inspiring. Um, and I love like the Black American tradition of the novel. I think my favorite novel of all time is probably Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. That's a novel that I, read like the Bible. I have read maybe like read it 5, 6 times. I love James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. There are lots of really amazing writers in that category as well. Um, as for a political novel, which I bring it up because that's the book that I wrote, I'm very deeply inspired by Latin American authors of the boom generation, Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and those people. And the Egyptian writers, Egyptian novelists have been a great influence on me. Naguib Mahfouz, Sonollah Ibrahim, Gamal El-Ghaitani, those people. Yeah, there's a lot of them. I don't know. I can just keep going.
Thank you. You mentioned that there's a Persian translation in the works for this book. Are you going to make any changes to the Persian translation?
I don't know how to see it. If anything, but probably not. But there are like certain kind of information in this book and contextualization that I had to do for people who are not Iranians, don't know much about the Iranian history and politics. I'll probably take out those passages, but they're not that many. Maybe it'd be like a page or two shorter than it is in English. But otherwise, no, I wouldn't change anything.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. I wanted to see if there were any final thoughts you wanted to say, or if you have, just kind of a general question, if there is anything that kind of gives you hope for the future of Iran, just with the last few minutes that we have left.
Not really. Yeah, don't have a lot of hope. I'm not like by character, not a hopeful person anyway. But no, not really, not like a particular comment. I just want to thank everyone who joined us today, this morning on your side of the country, in the afternoon here. and really appreciated you guys took time to be with us, and thanks for your questions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. We were honored to have you back. We wish it could have been in person, and hopefully the next time we'll see you in person at Stanford. Thank you to everyone who stayed on. This conversation was recorded and will be uploaded in a few weeks. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Stay safe.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. Us too.